tradition, and we do at least one lecture down in Cork. Going back to 1847, this is good. But the main course of business today, we're going to have a talk by Dermot Cokes. He'll be the main speaker, but obviously Harry Williamson is online, and then we're going to have Shannen Enright and Karen Hogan as well. So it's a paper by 4 people, changing patterns of secondary employment in Ireland. But before that, I just want to let the Assistant Director General, Ricky McMahon, who's Head of Statistics and Demographics here, just to give us a welcome. And then we'll hand it over to Dermot to take control. And then afterwards, we'll have 2 votes of thanks, and then we'll open up to questions in the room and online. And hopefully we'll get done by 6:30, and then we'll run to the train to go home.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I won't be long. I'm conscious of the train. So just on behalf of the CSO, I'd just like to welcome SSISI to the CSO Cork offices, and just to welcome all the guests to CSO and the CSO staff in the room, and also to all those attending online. And a special thanks to Paul and yourself for bringing SSISI to Cork. It's almost an annual occurrence now, and as ever, the paper being presented has real relevance to the CSO staff in Cork here. Today's paper, which Dermot is presenting, draws an awful lot from the labour force survey, and we've loads of the labour force survey and household survey staff in the room here. So it's a great opportunity for those people to see the fruits of their labour and the work presented by Dermot. So with that, I'll pass back to yourself, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much. So Dermot, I'll hand it over to you. And I know you have your co-author online, so we'll see how it goes.
All right, so the slides are coming up here now.
Yeah.
So look, first I want to start by saying thank you very much to the CSO for hosting us, and specifically a very large thank you to all CSO colleagues on the labour force service side who provided phenomenal assistance as we worked through the data. So we really appreciate all that help. It's been a fantastic help. Also thank you to my co-authors, Harry, Shannen and Karen, and also thank you to the peer reviewers who provided really thoughtful, informative comments that helps us to restructure the analysis as we work through. So as to why we use this particular data and looked at secondary employment, with secondary employment being the concept of people working multiple jobs. So it's been clear over a number of decades, the Irish labour market has undergone this phenomenal structural change. And that's just not the number of people at work. It's the resilience and flexibility. You know, if in 2020, early 2020, I was to say to you, within a matter of weeks or months of the economy being able to reopen, not only would the number of people at work have gone back to its pre-COVID level, but would continue this acceleration upwards, people would have thought that that's very, very optimistic. But that's what we've seen happen. But even beneath that, we see a number of other structural changes, whether it's this significant increase in the female participation rate, whether it's the impact of platform working, that kind of e-commerce working, and also the incidence of the number of people over 65, over 66 who continue to work and how those changes go. And this is a part of that secondary employment, this increase over time of the number of people choosing to work, choosing or considering themselves under financial circumstances forced to work multiple jobs. And it's not just the degree of increase in the last 20 years, it's Ireland's rapid rate of convergence from what is the EU average. So as we'll see as we work through this, if we looked at this data for 2020, 2002, 2003, Ireland was very much almost an outlier, and that wasn't really the pattern of working. But that has changed very, very significantly. And one of the things we'll try and tease out here is, it's the why this happens, okay? What are the type of conditions, what are the type of drivers that would make somebody opt to do so? And it may be on the positive sense that somebody wants to, transition into a new career. Perhaps it's the long tail of COVID, in that people who were furloughed or working part-time involuntarily during COVID had an opportunity to do something else in what was, in effect, spare time. And that has carried through. Or it could be on the far side that this is reflective of the cost of living and also the cost of housing, whether it's for rent or via mortgage, that some people who we would traditionally have considered to be highly educated in well-paid, stable professional employment find themselves, by dint of circumstances, choosing or forced to work multiple jobs. But this is quite complex in the literature, so we'll try to tease some of this out. I will say we don't have all the answers, and we come to the end, we'll be saying, suggesting some additional avenues for potential research. But it did strike us at the outset, this is an area, at least within the Irish labour market and economy, that's really, it's not gone unnoticed, but it hasn't probably been given the airing it deserves, particularly given the pace of change. So in terms of what we're looking at here, we typically look at the quantity of people who work rather than the quality issue, okay? But what we're seeing here now is we're saying there's 2.6 million people at work, but there's also a very significant cohort beneath that working 2, maybe 3 jobs. It's also worth bearing in mind what that means for quality of life, health and safety. If you have a cohort of people who are working full-time in their primary job, but then doing an extra 10, 15 hours, you know, in a second job, you know, what is that telling us about quality of life, and are there risks inherent to that? It is an area that has had, you know, a relative paucity of analysis completed. We want to look at how Ireland is comparing to Europe, and this idea of this isn't an Irish specific phenomenon. Actually, this is a convergence of Ireland where we were more of an outlier. So we will present a detailed analysis then of those in what we call secondary employment. We will look at the patterns, not only in the number of people with second jobs or third jobs, but in the sectors they work, whether they're employee or self-employee in either of those roles, because there's a kind of a divergent pattern there. And we look at the number of hours they work. And again, we'll put this in a comparative EU context, see what kind of patterns emerge. So moving on. So in terms of the literature, we have looked at this and we just summarized here, but it's covered in more detail in the paper. But really, a key issue here is the change in the nature and organization of work, and you know what that means in terms of much more flexible, fragmented labor markets. You know, the type of model people might have been used to in the 60s, 70s, all the way up of, you know, that kind of more rigid labor market, a job for life, people typically not moving between sectors too much. You know, that is something that's, you know, peeled away over time because there's a lot of structural changes within the economy and society. Job satisfaction, that's, you know, inversely related to the intention to work a second job. So you tend to see, a study in the US was looking at highly motivated IT officials. They might look at, you know, a sector that may well come under pressure from these exogenous shocks, as, you know, having a second job provides this kind of financial security blanket. And then persons working multiple jobs are more likely to experience lower levels of employment security. That makes sense, you know, higher levels of work pressure and more on social hours in their primary job. It may be an element that they can't get enough hours in their primary job, or that they're looking to transition into a new career by virtue of, you know, moving into a different sector or with a different employer working a second job, and then they can make that change over time. In terms of the motivations, there's a very interesting paper by Campion, Carroll and Moss. So that looks at these motivations in a couple of senses. So it's in terms of risk management against your job insecurity. It often the case with people in certain sectors looking to take on supplementary roles in another sector that might be a bit more stable. So for instance, someone working in freelance journalism, you know, having what the US literature typically refers to as moonlighting, you know, maybe in a retail sector or something where they're guaranteed a set of hours. In areas such as agriculture, off-farm employment is very common. As you might have noticed from my accent, I am from the part of the Midlands that's still quite agriculture. And actually that's something you've really seen in the past. You know, it is very, very typical now for people living in farming communities or farmers or farming households who would have traditionally had full-time employment on the farm to have at least one member of the household working in another sector, or even, you know, someone who is the primary farmer within a household actually doing something else aside. And that comes through some really interesting work that Chagas have done over time. They've really shown the extent of employment and earnings in those kind of agricultural communities and households have become increasingly diversified in that there's the on-farm and then the off-farm employment and earnings. So then more recent initiatives around promoting flexible working arrangements. And what that means, we see many women continue to opt for part-time roles because there's still a kind of traditional structure where I have a wife and a child at home, and you know, clearly, I think if I'll put something in the dishwasher, I'm a miracle worker of some sort. Obviously, someone else is doing all the heavy lifting, and you know, it is the case still that you know, women do more of those family duties. But when you look at the flexible working arrangements, this comes back to this sense of COVID being this almost a series break here, that people are given an opportunity to go do different things, and there's a cohort of people who may have maintained, you know, that moonlighting aspect of something else they moved into. And then favorable tax treatment across secondary employment, so PRSI calculated independently. I'm not sure that that's in different jurisdictions with different tax codes, that is more of an issue, I think, than it is here, because your income is treated by revenue pool and you're just taxed that, tax credits, I suppose, for the primary job or the secondary job. Now, in addition to those financial issues, there's areas around career development and personal fulfillment. So maybe people want to obtain new skills or explore, entrepreneurial ventures and undertaking voluntary work. And that gives an opportunity for skills development and engagement. I should note for the LFX data that voluntary work, so work without pay, isn't counted in these particular statistics, but it's in the broader scheme of people doing something else outside of a primary job. It's still of interest, but it might be something that we need to look at further down the line. Overall, the motivations tend to be quite diverse and influenced by economic cycles, and to some extent driven by necessity during downturn. But when you look in the literature, there's this idea of necessity versus opportunity. So it may be that some people view this as an opportunity, as I said, to transition into a new career or to obtain advancement by getting skills doing something outside your primary job, whereas other people may see this as necessity. Okay, this comes back to this idea, and we'll see it as we work through. People who are highly qualified, working in professional roles, is there an extent to which the cost of living issues or cost of housing mean that some of these people feel there is a need to take on secondary employment? Again, that motivation issue is something that we look at here to some extent, but I think it would be very much amenable to future work actually in that area. And I would say as well, Bloom and his colleagues have done a number of papers, and one of those looking at how COVID-19 has accelerated an underlying trend towards a greater incidence of working from home, which in turn can provide some people more scope to do, moonlighting in an additional job. And then the next slide, I think, yes. So a complicating or clarifying factor. So the data we used here is up to 2023, but you will, some of you will know, Supreme Court had a ruling towards the end of 2023 on this idea of whether certain delivery drivers were employees rather than self-employed contractors. Now, ultimately, they ruled in favour of, what it was the tax appeals commissioners, but effectively that those delivery drivers were employees. So that's under the definition of the Taxes Consolidation Act of 97. So one of the issues we just flag here, but again, that would be very interesting to see in future research, is how that ruling, and I would note that Revenue have issued very comprehensive up-to-date guidance to all employers since 2024, that they need to revisit their classification of their employees and make sure they're in line with that Supreme Court decision. I think the Supreme Court Justice has set out 5 distinct tests. So will we see this in the data from 2024 onwards, as we start looking at more up-to-date data? And again, when you put this into context, some of you will be aware that, almost at this post-pandemic benefit, government introduced a range of labour market changes, whether it was introduction of statutory sick leave, an additional bank holiday, the transition towards a living wage, and also we're due to have pension auto-enrolment come on stream towards the end of this year. Does that in itself give an incentive for less scrupulous employers to see that the cost of employing somebody, the cost of being the employer, has now become more expensive, and that they try to, encourage or incentivize towards this effectively bogus self-employment? Okay, so it's how we tease out the intricacies of that and how they're all interlinked. The next future rounds of data following on from that decision and those changes will be really interesting, and then how you see that in terms of secondary employment also. So look, and then that gives you the context of what we're trying to look at here. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Harry, who will walk you through the methodology and some of the key findings. And then I'll sum up at the end in terms of what we think the key takeaways here are, and again, what we think future avenues of research should be in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Dermot. So I hope everyone can hear me presenting online. So as Dermot said, I'll just talk through some of the main findings of the research and how Ireland compares to Europe in terms of secondary employment rates. So first of all, just in terms of the data sources that we used Eurostat data on the number of people in multiple jobs, split by country, gender, age, occupation, and hours worked. And we also obtained custom tabulations on sectors, employment status, full-time equivalent employment and regional data from the CSO, and we're grateful to the CSO for providing us with that data. As Dermot mentioned, the timeframe under analysis is Q2 2002 to Q2 2023. So you look at roughly a 20-year period, and we don't look at the last year of data. So before getting into the findings, just want to highlight some of the caveats of the research. So standard LFS definitions of employment are used throughout the research, which is a person who works for at least 1 hour for pay or profit in the reference week. And so in line with this definition, volunteering isn't included as a form of employment or secondary employment. Another important point is that this definition is likely to underestimate the true number of people with multiple jobs in the population. So the irregular nature of secondary jobs mean some might be missed from official statistics, as the LFS definitions require someone to have taken secondary work within the reference week. So if there's a broad definition of, say, a month, that may capture more people with secondary employment. So in addition, some people might not perceive irregular odd jobs or short-term projects as a second job, so wouldn't necessarily be captured in survey results. And the shadow economy as well, which was estimated to be about 10% of GDP in 2015. And within that, the shadow labor force, anyone working in that sector wouldn't be captured here. So some analysis by revenue published in October 2022, and it found that using a month-long definition and just looking at employees, so people that are employees in both their primary and secondary job, there are approximately 85,000 multiple job holders as of October 2022. And given that our own analysis suggests that this combination, so people that are employees in both jobs, makes up about 40% of total secondary employment, there are potentially about 200,000 multiple job holders in Ireland if we're to use the month-long definition that Revenue used in their analysis. So now just looking at our findings. So Dermot mentioned already, the rise in the number of second jobs in recent decades sort of coincided with a rapid rise in employment more generally. So the left-hand side graph shows that the number of people in employment overall rose from about 1.85 million in 2002 up to 2.6 million in 2023, which is an increase of about 44%. And in the same period, sort of shown on the right-hand side graph, the number of people with secondary employment rose from 35,000 up to 93,000, which was an increase of a couple of 100%. And we can see that trends in secondary employment have sort of broadly followed the same cyclical trend as employment overall, so falling after the financial crisis and accelerating rapidly in the last couple of years. As a result of this increase, which is shown by the orange line, we look at the number of people employed with 2 jobs as a percentage of total employment, and that's risen from about 1.9% in Q2 2002 up to 3.5% in Q2 2023. And that increase was particularly stark in the last 5 or 6 years. So this slide shows some comparisons to the rest of Europe in terms of secondary employment rates. And as of Q2 2023, there are about 8 million people with second jobs across the EU, which made up 3.9% of total employment. And in the UK, the corresponding figure was about 3.7%. So Ireland, therefore, has a lower share than the EU average at 3.5%, which is the 11th lowest share out of the EU 27. So I don't have time to go into specific country comparisons today, but sort of one surprising finding was that sort of richer Scandinavian countries, as well as the Netherlands and Switzerland, have very high shares of people with 2 jobs, so close to 10% in some cases. There also appears to be an inverse relationship between the size of a shadow economy and undeclared work and secondary employment. So some of the Balkan states, for example, have very low levels of secondary employment, but are often found in the literature to have larger informal economies. So this next map shows secondary employment rates in Europe in Q2 2003, so 20 years earlier than what the previous map showed. And it sort of highlights how the EU average share has remained relatively stable over the last 20 years, So overall, it's increased by just 0.5 percentage points since 2003. And in the same period, the share of secondary employment in Ireland rose from 1.8% up to 3.5%, so 1.7 percentage point increase. So the gap is Ireland sort of converged on the EU average rate over that period. And interestingly, so within the EU 27, 14 countries saw increases within those 20 years, and 13 countries saw a fall. So all sort of converging on the EU average. So we also look at the sectoral share of employment in the second job. And as Dermot's mentioned, second jobs tend to be concentrated in the agricultural and services sectors, with this number of second jobs in the service sector increasing significantly in recent years. Throughout the time series, sort of very few number of people have second jobs in industry, perhaps due to sort of the long working hours or terms conditions within those sectors. During the early 2000s, towards the left-hand side of that graph, second jobs in the services sector, shown in blue, made up approximately 50% of all second jobs. There's significant share in agriculture during that time. And this changed a lot after the financial crisis, and there was a significant drop-off in the share of people employed in agriculture in their second job. So if you look today, there are about 2/3 of people with a second job employed in services and roughly a quarter in agriculture. Saying that, despite this drop-off in agricultural secondary employment, people are still disproportionately likely to work in agriculture in their second job compared to the labour force more generally. So roughly 4% of people in employment overall work in agriculture, whereas nearly a quarter of people with a second job work in agriculture in their second job. This next slide shows both the gender and employment status split of multiple job holders in Ireland. So starting with the gender breakdown on the left-hand side, see that 64% of people in Ireland who have a second job are male. And this is a significant fall from the sort of over 80% share we saw in the late 1990s, but this remains well above the EU average. So on average in the EU, roughly 50% of multiple job holders are male and 50% female. So even taking into account the likelihood of being in employment to begin with, men are far more likely to have a second job than women. So roughly 4.2% of men in employment in Ireland have a second job, compared to 2.6% of women. And again, as Dermot alluded to, so one possible explanation for this is that women are more likely to undertake unpaid caring duties for children or relatives, which may effectively act as a second job and leave sort of limited time for more paid employment. And Ireland performs relatively poorly with the EU when it comes to childcare policies, which could act as a barrier to primary or secondary employment for women. So another surprising finding, so indicated on the right-hand side graph, is that there is an even split in terms of the people being either self-employed or employees in their second job. And this is in contrast to the labour market as a whole, where roughly 80% of people are employees in their primary job. Interestingly, so the employment status of someone's first job seemingly has no impact on whether someone is an employee or self-employed in their second job. So roughly half of people who are employees in their first job are employees in their second job, and half again are self-employed, with the same self-employees in their primary job, and then roughly half are employees and self-employees in their second job. And the most popular combination overall is employee-employee, followed by an employee in their primary job and then self-employed in their second job. So also briefly want to discuss patterns and average hours worked of second job holders. And the average number of hours worked in the second job has fallen over time from about 16.4 hours in 2008 down to 13.8 hours in 2023. And I'll discuss this further on the next slide, but the majority of second job holders also work full-time in their primary job, 64%, and this cohort typically work more hours in their second job. So another point just worth noting is that there's a clear seasonality effect in the data. There's a clear spike in average hours worked in Q3 each year, linked to the share of agricultural employment and as due to harvest season each year. So this slide shows hours worked by full-time and part-time status in a bit more detail. So on average, people that are employed full-time in their primary job work an average of 14.8 hours in their second job, which is shown by the middle blue bar there on the graph. And this is compared to 12.1 hours for people that are employed part-time in their primary job. So people that are employed full-time work significantly more hours in their second job than those who work part-time in their primary job. And the splits here are quite more significant for men than for women. So men work an average of 15.6 hours per week in their second job compared to 11 hours per week for women. And given that a full-time job, so in the LFS at least, is usually defined as working at least 30 hours a week, although we know many people work more than that in their primary job, there's a significant cohort of people who work more than 45 hours per week in total. And these are sort of long weekly hours for different cohorts will potentially have implications for health and safety, for work-life balance, sort of mistakes in the workplace, leading to injury potentially, but also implications for labor productivity for similar reasons. So output per hour worked may decrease if workers are too fatigued from working too many hours across multiple jobs. So finally, just in terms of hours, this graph shows how average hours worked in Ireland compare to the EU. So we can see that in Ireland, people with a second job work actually 13.8 hours in that job compared to an EU average of 11.2, so fairly significantly more. This varies a lot by country, so just 8 hours in Germany, for example, and as high as 18.6 hours in Greece. There are many potential reasons behind those country-to-country differences. So as part of our analysis, we also conducted some regression econometric analysis, and we ran a logic model and examined marginal effects, showing the proportion of workers who had more than one job over the period 2019 to 2023. And we use this model because of a number of categorical variables in the model. We also test interactions on the main variables where effects were seen to be significant, which I'll go into here as well. So here are the main results of our model. And as I said earlier, the results will confirm that women are far more less likely to have a second job compared to men. The odds of having a second job also increase significantly by age, as well as education attainment. And those, particularly with the highest education levels, about marginally more likely to have a second job compared to those with medium education levels. Finally, sort of an interesting finding here was we found that non-Irish nationals were roughly half as likely to have a second job compared to Irish nationals. And this is linked to the share of agricultural employment in the second job. So that non-Irish nationals are typically far less likely to work in agriculture compared to Irish nationals. To also examine interaction effects among the significant variables. So we find that the likelihood of having a second job remains relatively static across ages for women, whereas men tend to drive the age effect seen in the model, particularly sort of 45 to 64 age category, declining again for people up to age 65. Looking at gender and education, the effects are stronger for women than men. So the odds of secondary employment increase significantly with education attainment for women, which can be shown by the blue line there, whereas for men, only a slight increase the higher educated earners. And finally, just looking at age and education, we examined this too, but there weren't any significant results here. So the education effect that doesn't really differ for the different age cohorts in the analysis. So I think those are all our results here, and I'll just pass back to Dermot to sum up and speak about some avenues for future research.
Thanks very much, Harry, for that. It just so I think what the data really shows, people with multiple jobs more likely to be male, middle-aged, and highly educated. There is no typical here. I would say actually that was part of the surprise for myself when we start working in this state. I think I had an idea in my head of what someone with a second job would be, and that person was more likely to be working in, to have lower levels of education and be working in, less stable, atypical type of employment. There's actually a large cohort of people here who are highly qualified, working in solid professional roles, and who are quite advanced in their careers. So that brings us on at the end. I'll come back to that at the end in terms of avenues for future research. We can say the incidence in Ireland is still below the EU average, which, as we saw there, we were virtually half of the EU prevalence rate 20 years ago, and that gap has effectively narrowed out now at this point. In terms of platform work, self-employed in a second job still outstripped by employees in the second job. But this issue of platform work, etc., and bogus self-employment, I referenced this Supreme Court ruling, what, about 13, 14 months ago now. That's something we want to get back into in the next future rounds of research to see how that's feeding through. And hours worked in second jobs, there's a heterogeneous effect here across genders, but really the reality is most people working full-time in a primary job are working something in the region of 40 hours. So if we're saying the average work in a second job is 14 hours, and we're saying about 40% of people are employee, that combination, there's quite a few people out there then working something north of 50 hours per week. And there are questions to be asked, as we mentioned, in terms of health and safety, labour productivity, etc. Another point just to make, I think it's covered in the main paper, of the 93,000 we identified using the LFS data, I think 84,000 of those are under 65, so something close to 10,000 people aged over 65 working multiple jobs. Okay, so there's quite a cohort there, and that's something I'd like to tease out a bit more. So in terms of that future research, understanding this cohort who work full-time in a primary job and then long hours in a second job, what are the motivations here? The why we've touched on, but through the prism really of the literature and as much as we can tease out in the Irish data. But I think that's the part we'd really like to drill into next. What is happening here? Is it, as I said, is it necessity or is it opportunity? Okay, because there's social policy, labour market implications, etc. in that space. The extent to which this might develop into full-time self-employment. We have a very big focus on, Ireland's enterprise ecosystem and promoting entrepreneurship. But, what is the scope here? Are we seeing people who are trying to transition from being a PYE or an employee using secondary employment to transition across into self-employment? And if so, are the supports provided by the state sufficient to help them on that particular journey? And there's a couple of other things we'd like to look at. I would like to go back into the econometric, the regression piece, and do more as we use more of that more up-to-date data and see how that pieces out. And as always, data around pay per hour. We won't relitigate that particular battle here, but that type of more advanced revenue data, if we could map that in as well into future streams of the work, would be really useful for this and for many other projects. Look, I think that just kind of sums up where we are, but this is really just to kind of roll over the stone on this particular topic, but we do think there's lots more valuable work that could be done. Thank you very much.
Excellent presentation and work. So our first vote of thanks today comes from the CSO, and it's Tara Davis.
Evening, everyone. Thank you. So I'm just going to go through a few observations I have from Dermot's paper, maybe some insight I could give around potential future research that you touched upon there, Dermot, as well also. So first of all, thank you, Dermot, for such a detailed insight into second jobs. It's great for ourselves and CSO, in particular myself and my team in the labour market and earnings division, to see such rich analysis come from the LFS RMF. And to be fair, for such an extensive breadth and thorough in-depth investigation you kind of did into the subject matter as well. Because even when I was asked to be discussant and I was reading through your paper, I'm taking note of potential other topics you could talk about, and I'd read a few paragraphs more, and there you talked about it already. So you took a few of my points in advance. So also, I suppose, just to thank you as well for mentioning the measurement challenges we're facing in household service these days. So Irish society has changed dramatically in the last few years, and it is getting far more difficult to collect household survey data. Individuals don't want people knocking on their doors anymore. And as even the subject matter of second jobs, people are getting harder to reach. And those demographics, which we have found difficult to reach, are even getting more difficult now with these changes. So great credit is due to our field staff and our interviewers who are out there on the doorsteps and putting in significant effort to drive our response rates to ensure ourselves and the likes of yourselves doing this research have such high quality data to do such thorough investigations on. Also, you mentioned a good bit around the digital platform and the gig economy. So we too feel the pain there, Dermot, in terms of we had a Eurostat pilot questionnaire last year in the LFS, and it was equally unpopular with both the field interviewers and the respondents. It's a very difficult concept for people to understand what it actually means to be employed through a platform, in particular when you consider proxy interviews and the level of proxy interviews we have in the LFS. So we didn't publish the results due to, I suppose, a significant level of contradiction within them. And it wasn't just amongst ourselves, it was observed across Europe. So for example, we got results such as more people were working on the digital platform than were actually registered with it. So Eurostat taken this feedback on board, and they've gone back to, I guess, the drawing board a bit with all the various countries. And there's a task force continuing on digital platform at the moment, and we're represented on it. But essentially, there will be a fully fledged LFS module on digital platform in 2027. So it gives you great scope to come back and maybe do version 2 of your paper, and it might answer some of the whys around people are doing the second employment. But it does include topics like you mentioned, in terms of the legislation and the law case around, do you have access to certain benefits like illness benefits? It also asks why you do use, or why are you unemployed, or why you choose to be employed on the digital platform. So again, that'll be in the field of 2027. So some few things that jumped out to me, like yourself, I had a bit of perception what I imagined the second job person would look like. And so I found it particularly interesting around the higher education levels, because again, I thought it'd be more about those people building up their income. I suppose you did touch on the entrepreneurial aspect, but something as well maybe to look at would be the earnings variable on the LFS, and see if there is a connection between that higher education and earnings, because I guess high education levels don't always necessarily equate to high earnings, and our graduate, I think, publication shows that certain fields of education lead to higher earnings. So maybe something to look at. I also look at these things as well in terms of data gaps, and maybe access we have, maybe that others don't, and where we could go with it. But it'd be interesting to look at maybe family businesses as well in terms of the effect on second jobs. And in terms of the earning piece, maybe earnings growth in first job, primary job versus second job, or potentially even looking at longitudinal analysis using the PMOD data set in terms of those who've moved from secondary job and making it their primary employment, and I guess the effect on earnings around that. So it might answer some of the whys around the earnings piece or financial strain. You touched on the earnings as well, Dermot, I think, and like yourself, I would only love to have something like hours worked or hours paid on the PMOD file, because I'm a big fan of PMOD and the insight and it has changed completely the outputs and how our outputs look and CSO from using it. We've increased the number of outputs we have significantly on earnings data using the PMOD file. So it would be great to get something like that on the PMOD file. I suppose as well, the good news in looking at the PMOD file is that the results generally line up with the LFS and what you presented in your paper. And when you talk about second jobs likely to be in episodes, we took a look in terms of PMOD data, and for those who worked 50 weeks continuously in the year in both their first and second jobs, it's actually less than 1%, it's around the 0.8% mark. So you're right in that it tends to be more stagnant or episodic throughout the year. When we take away the 50-week restriction, it increases to around the 10% over the years, to between 10 to 11%. So again, that supports your circa 200,000 figure kind of in the year. And also when we looked at it with the October reference, we got very similar to our revenue colleagues as well, around 85,000. So it's great that the data is actually lining up and supporting each other in its findings. What we did find interesting as well is when we looked at it by region, obviously PMOD is employees only. So when we looked at it, we did see the high numbers as well in Dublin. About 30% of employees with second job were actually in Dublin, and the Southwest and the Mid-East as well. But we didn't see the proportionate split that you saw with the border and the West. And I guess that's down to PMOD being employees only. So when you take away the self-employed element, which is more likely to be largely agricultural, number of employees in agriculture aren't high. That probably explains it, but the distribution was more even across the region. So in conclusion, I suppose the big question remains of the why people have second jobs, why you touch on some of them. I guess we still don't have the concrete answers around them. So while the digital platform launching might offer some insight and the earnings might offer some insight, something else maybe to consider would be a linkage project maybe between Silk and PMOD, because Silk has a financial wellbeing module where do you struggle to make ends meet? And again, it might give particular characteristics around those that kind of do the second jobs for financial reasons. So just as a general information note, in case people aren't available or aware online, is that we do have a 10% PMOD RMF available for researchers. And if you would like to find out more information or wonder how you could seek access to it for research purposes, Emer Heffernan at CSO.ie is your contact person. And just in summary, thanks again, Dermot, and your co-authors, of course, online, for all the hard work you put into this and the extensive insight you've offered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the second Tara of today, Tara McIndoe from the Central Bank of Ireland. So you have the floor, Tara.
Thanks very much. I have a couple of slides, which I will try and share.
They're coming up, yeah.
Super. Okay, so yeah, I'd like to echo a lot of what Tara said, and thank you very much. It's a really interesting piece of work and a very careful and detailed characterization of secondary employments, and really well motivated from the perspective that it looks like we are converging to the European average on this. Although on some aspects, for example, average hours worked in second job were actually ahead, and that increase seems to have been sustained, over the sort of last 6 or 7 or 8 years compared to prior to that. So really timely piece of work. So I really think there'll be a lot of interested readers, both domestically and perhaps further afield. So in my remarks right now, I'd like to focus on, exactly what the authors suggest for avenues for future work. And some of these I do think are feasible with the primary data used for the paper that we've seen presented today. So I really look forward to that future work, Dermot, that you mentioned. So I'll sketch out here the reasons that I think the follow-up work will be highly complementary to the paper today. So I just think that additional empirical insights, will be useful to understand whether the growth in secondary jobs is kind of on balance more supply or demand driven. And alongside today's paper, I think those additional empirical insights are likely to generate, rich policy insights, which I think many people in the room and online would be interested in. Okay, so, is the incidence of secondary jobs an indicator for primary job quality? So it's an important question, and I agree with the authors that the paper does a really good job of suggesting a rejection of this hypothesis. I'd like to suggest that a probate regression examining the predictive power of the primary employment characteristics for take-up of a second job might assist in this a little bit. So whilst a lot of the covariates used in the logits presented in tables 3 in the paper are characteristics of the employee themselves, there are differences obviously that you point out in the descriptive analysis between characteristics of the primary and secondary jobs. So for example, actual hours worked, gross earnings, which Tara had already talked about, and possibly separate regressions for men and women, because it looks as though they choose different types of secondary jobs and have different types of primary jobs, men compared to women. And I also think there might be a role for hours. So there are indicator variables on this in LFS, like full-time, part-time, which you have for the primary job, but there is also actual hours worked, including for at least some of the secondary jobs that are recorded in LFS. So I think that results from this additional regression analysis would provide a basis on which to infer more formally and precisely whether secondary jobs can or cannot be used to indicate relative quality of primary job. And as Tara said, the education variable is a really good predictor of quality of job, but it doesn't perfectly correlate. So there might be insights there, as well as sorry, I think my slides are my slides moving, Paul?
Oh, they're not showing full screen and they're not moving. I was just going to say that to you, but
Okay, I wonder.
you can try again, share, but your points are loud and clear, so to be fair.
Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry. So yeah, I think that additional regression results could be used to infer the supply of secondary employees, which might get a bit at the agriculture question more precisely, for example. And then this hours question is more broad than what I've just sketched out with regards to possibly running some additional empirics. So we know that total hours worked have not been rising as quickly as total employment. In fact, average hours worked is falling. And we know that this falling trend in average hours worked is common across EU countries, but it has been accelerating since the pandemic. So this has implications for worker productivity, household labor income growth, and may represent labor hoarding by firms, depending on whether it's a choice by workers or firms. So one of the paper's striking findings is the number of hours worked in total by those with second jobs. And so whilst the total numbers of secondary job holders remain small, that is not enough to explain the accelerating downward trend in average hours worked. It has grown rapidly over recent years. So I'm just wondering if today's paper can say something about the falling average hours worked trend more generally. And then I think there are also some emerging themes. So the paper represents a deep dive into an important phenomenon, secondary jobs, but there are other recent structural changes to the labor market which seem to have been boosted, for want of a better word, since the pandemic, including the rise in participation for, in particular, sort of slightly older, more educated women, acceleration of hybrid working arrangements, both of which are mentioned in the paper, and the adoption or exposure to AI in the labor market, which Tara touched on. So whilst the paper touches on many of these things, together they suggest a rather changed landscape for workers and the firms that hire them, now and going forward. So in particular, the paper is, looking at the characteristics of secondary jobs. Many of the findings are slightly counterintuitive, and so it makes the paper really attractive for the reader. So persons with multiple jobs, more likely than not to be male, middle-aged, and highly educated, was definitely counterintuitive to what I was expecting. So can the authors talk to the role that secondary work plays in this changing landscape more broadly? For example, is this sort of supply or demand driven? Would be really interesting to know. And I think there is some empirical analysis which would assist with this. And the primary reason I was sharing slides is because I wanted to show you this nice Sankey diagram, which isn't, I don't actually have one for the data because I didn't leave myself enough time to do it. But I think one of these nice sort of mapping diagrams to map the primary sector of employment to the secondary sector of employment would be really useful for readers and would help to isolate whether there are specific employment sector pairs that are driving some of the results, sort of trying to tease out that agriculture and services point that the paper makes. So thanks very much for the paper overall. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thanks very much, Tara. Another excellent vote of thanks. So I'm going to open it up to the floor here and online. So if you ask a question, it's good just to, we normally document in the paper's proceedings of the sessions, we put your name and title, and we have a recording here. So but just remember to say who you are and who you're linked with. But who wants to go? online.
Yeah, so Colin Hanley, CSO on the Labour Force Survey. So thanks very much for a fantastic presentation and the paper as well. So I suppose one thing I was looking at it when I was looking at it in the presentation was that the secondary jobs particularly increased in the last 5 or 6 years. I suppose there's a potential that I suppose COVID might have had that impact on it. Did you see the external economic environment having an impact prior to this? As a one question, and then a follow-up on the COVID aspect, is remote working having an impact on secondary jobs? Because I suppose you've heard about people who, they're working full-time remotely, that they might, in software development or something like that, they have a bit more scope to potentially take on additional work.
Do you want to take a batch of questions?
Yeah, so if there's more. Right?
Dr. Deirdre Tohar, CISO. So I'm just wondering if you had the conditional effects, so you're looking at the difference in the male-female ratio of those who are taking second jobs. If you conditional out agriculture, so looked at it by the sector, would you still have that same gender split? So is it a partially the divergence of Ireland from the rest of Europe? Is that a consequence of how high the agriculture we still have in terms of the prevalence of people working in agriculture in Ireland compared to other EU countries? And so in terms of being able to do that comparison, to do it by sector of the second job and compare that across Europe.
Francis, Roanne.
Yeah, thank you very much for the paper. I just have a couple of small questions. One, is it possible using the data to look at the household decision in relation to market participation? So I'm thinking of, a couple with kids. It could be the case that one member takes on a second job because the other person actually doesn't work for a period of time because of the age of the children or whatever. So in other words, it's a joint household decision. I'm wondering, is there anything that would allow you to look at that? The second point is it possible to get from the data, and I don't think it probably is, but some way of looking at whether the rates of pay in the second job are higher or lower than the first job on an hourly basis? And you might think, well, that'd be highly unlikely, but it's not necessarily the case. It could be that somebody's experimenting with something which is highly paid, but there aren't a lot of hours available, and they're using, if you like, the permanent job or the full-time job as the base from which they're working. And just the third point, and I don't know whether CSO would have an insight into this. I mean, that growth in the number of second jobs is for Ireland was just never talked about before. America always had it. I mean, is it in our case that there has been a big shift into this, or is it that they've come from the informal sector of the economy into the formal sector? In other words, the revenue is doing its job more effectively than previously. And effectively what we're getting here is a pickup of something that was around for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Breed O'Brien. You're on mute, Breed.
Yes, I turned on the camera and forgot to turn on the microphone. Apologies for that. I should have done that the other way around, but yeah. Thank you for the paper, very interesting, and it would be, thank you for the presentation. It'd be lovely to see the full document, or certainly the PowerPoints and the response as well from the colleague from the central bank will be interesting. Just in terms of the service sector jobs, do you know whether it's which end of the labour market are the service sector jobs? Given the fact that I was struck by the fact that you've found that it tended to be people, say, who were maybe better educated. So could it be assumed that it's the higher end, or would that be an assumption? I would just do we know in terms of how related so we're seeing people are in different sectors, like, so if somebody maybe is in a service sector job and doing another service sector job, are they related? Is it that they're developing in their own area of work, or feel outside of their primary employment they can secure more income? Or do we have enough data just to kind of get behind some of the whys people are doing this, and who is doing it? Thank you.
Okay, you go ahead.
Can I throw in one?
That's okay, John, one more.
Do the batch. I'm just wondering, did you try interacting national, non-national with education attainment? I'm just wondering, is there a story there about recognition of qualifications across countries, or for some other reason why advanced qualifications might be translating into higher earnings in the first job?
Sorry. So I'll range across these in no particular order. And at some point I'll have to call on my colleague Harry, because from memory I just don't know the answer to one or two of these. So in terms of interaction for nationality and education, no, we didn't do that. But actually I think for the final version, if it's allowable, we'll run that and add it to the work as well. I think that's actually really interesting observation. And similarly for Deirdre, controlling for the agriculture piece for Ireland and EU, no, that wasn't done. Actually, I think that would be a really valuable addition there, and we could just tease that out in the text. So in the long version of the paper, which many of you haven't seen, we do go into quite a bit of detail on that, but we can add that as a sub-segment. And that wouldn't be too much additional work, but actually we'd be really interested to see what that looks like. I thought Colin, who I think I have plagues over the years with many queries. Remote working, yes, we think remote working, acts as kind of an anchor here. We do that kind of break-in series that people had an opportunity to go do different things, and some of that has followed through. So someone might have done, what the US literature would refer to as moonlighting, and that has become, because people are highly adaptive, and actually, you make a change that otherwise you wouldn't have done if you hadn't gone through that kind of the COVID lockdown periods. But that's something we want to kind of tease out in the follow-up iterations to this work, just to see how sticky that really is. The external factors aspect, I think, is a really interesting one. This is an area I'm actually looking at for an entirely separate piece of work, but it maps onto this in the sense there is a sense that some sectors within the services, because either they're carrying labour vacancies and they can't fill positions, and or because the cost of labour has become more expensive on foot of a variety of different factors, okay? And also the fact that their cost of operating has increased, because, as you would have seen, energy prices obviously had this level shift in 2022, and that hasn't really eased out. So, if business owners would say, well, yeah, prices aren't rising at the rates that they were, but they haven't gone back to what they were 3 years ago, okay? And for that variety of factors, do you see that firms are not letting go staff, but they're restructuring their own opening hours? And I'm sure people, in large urban areas, you kind of see this, that, for instance, restaurants or cafes that opened 7 days a week, maybe now open 5 days a week, okay? That kind of organic restructuring on foot of those pressures, does that feed through to this data? Okay, where you have a scenario then where someone is not able to get the number of hours from their primary employer, and because of that external shock and what that means for the operating structure of their employer, they now need to go source hours somewhere else. But I think these are type of things we do need to tease out more. But that type of external shock is kind of one that I don't think we really would have thought of too much before. But you're kind of seeing this now, actually. And part of that is also to follow on from COVID, in the sense to which people now, are using e-commerce platforms in terms of food delivery, et cetera. And it's kind of shaped people's behavior and attitudes. So Francis, then, is it a joint household decision? That's something I have to look at from memory. I don't know that we have the data to look at that, but it'd be a really interesting one to try to tease out. Similarly, on rates of pay, specifically on the hourly rate and how we compare those across jobs, that's something we'll have to go and look at again, just to see can we answer that. And on the issue of informal to formal, I'm not sure that that's the case, because there doesn't seem, when we kind of reviewing this over 20 years, there's nothing at least obvious to me, and I'm certainly happy to take on board a contrary view, that something happened in terms of compliance and regulation that forced the shift of people moving out of kind of a grey economy and registering. It seems to just be, I don't like the phrase, the servitization of the economy, but this booming services sector and the wide variety of things that are covered there, and maybe vacancies and people are being pulled in, because they can do that via different platforms, etc. And that's something, looking at the US or the North American economy, actually, you see a lot of that reflected in the statistics there. And then Breda was referring to, can we segment the services sector? I will actually have to ask, maybe Harry knows just from memory, I am not sure that we had that for the second jobs. I think we just had industry, agriculture, services, but Harry can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, so we don't have more sectors, but we do have an occupational breakdown. So about 37% of second job holders are managers or professionals in their primary job, and about 17% are service and sales workers, which are maybe more on the lower paid end of the labour market. So sort of there is a higher share of people who are in sort of professional roles or managerial roles, which may be higher paid, which perhaps suggests that sort of necessity self-employment it isn't so prevalent for lots of workers. We don't have a more detailed sectoral breakdown, but we do have that occupational breakdown.
I should say that's covered in detail in the actual full paper, the occupation versus sector issue.
Okay, we still time for another round of questions, so online or
can there win the all-learning? That's it, this session.
I have a few. Okay, Kieran, were you interested? Kieran, yeah.
Yes, first of all, very interested. Well, I'm one of Tara's babies in the earnings section of the CSO. Tara's elderly babies. I would be wondering, in terms of length of time people would be occupying two employments, in terms of the health and safety implications.
More questions? I had a few. The things that hit me were what's going on in Iceland. Was that was 13% at the beginning and at the end. So that's kind of an interesting comparison. When we did a study, or a few students did a study on women empowerment in Africa, there was a kind of a debate here where Irish Aid were focusing on giving kind of the seed and some sort of rights to women on farms, to kind of empower them on farms. But actually, when the work was done by Tanzanians themselves, they really emphasized the point that if women could get a secondary job and an independent income stream, that was actually much more important for women empowerment. And I even knew that from my own grandmother and others who said, actually, during World War II, women started to work and get their own income, and they never gave that up. They said to have that independence and that income stream. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then lastly, of course, following Francis Joanne's point and just reflecting on myself, people are getting married a bit later, and then they have a bunch of kids who are quite demanding between 45 and 65 in terms of the need for income. And then the parents, and then of course the bigger houses, etc. So you kind of wonder, is there a little bit of correlation there between need and the number of children, but when they're actually born at that age group, because the people are hitting that sort of high income demand at a much later age, actually, compared to earlier days. So that's whether that type of analysis can be done. Anyone else in the room? Go ahead.
So Carl Doherty, I'm in demography in the Central Statistics Office. Just add to kind of an interesting analysis, kind of Deirdre mentioned the agriculture impact, and controlling for that in the logistic regression would be really interesting across the board. I think those interactions between some type of agriculture lag in terms of in agriculture in some way in primary and secondary versus not in agriculture. So interacting that with age, nationality across the board, I think would be really interesting, given that it was so prominent in the results in terms of agriculture.
Yeah, firstly, so Kieran, in terms of length of time in the two jobs, so again, I think Tara touched on this too, that, it does seem to be highly episodic, and that's not something that's unique to Ireland. But we would be interested as we work through this to see, what does that mean? How does it differ for the characteristics of the sector, the occupation, and the individual, how long they stay in those jobs? Because if we're saying for a month at a time, someone is working north of 50 hours a week, that's very different if someone is doing that for 10 months. And then you see those implications. And it's not just at the kind of prosaic level of labour productivity and health and safety, but clearly the well-being agenda has become much more important in economics and the social sciences more generally. And that is a real negative factor. And you can see that again, looking at the international literature we touched at the top, that it is very significantly inversely correlated with quality of life, job satisfaction, etc. And Paul, in terms of Iceland, I don't know. maybe it might be that somebody wants to sponsor some kind of study tour to Iceland, so we can figure it out. But it is an odd one, because actually, as you read the maps that Harry prepared, I can't claim to have done so, but as you read those from east to west, you see very different patterns. But Iceland just seems to stick out so much because you kind of take what we would consider small advanced economies, say a Finland or a Denmark, where you're getting close to 10%, but Iceland is kind of a level above that. The female empowerment part, I think that's really a really interesting point, and it's so true here. What we kind of see, and again, even from experience with some other projects, we take it that there are many women who are in a primary employment, in terms of the household, etc. It's unenumerated employment, but but they're actually having the opportunity to embark on a second job, and as that occupation outside the household, but also as an anchor value for as their children get older, that they have an opportunity and continue to build up their skills, or at least maintain their skills. So when the opportunity rises again, they have avenues and opportunities open to them. In terms of the correlation of it with age, dependence, and intake of a second job, yeah, that's something actually I think that really warrants, because it comes back to what we were saying earlier around the rationale, the why. There's another way where you see this is clearly people get married at an older age now, but in terms of that impact and on the cost issue and what that means, people are having fewer children. They're getting married older, having children later, having fewer children. And that may well be one avenue which reflects that kind of cost factor. The other one may potentially that someone within the household, as for Francis's point, I think, the household aside, someone else has to go do a second job. Another issue I might just point out as well is, it may be, and this warrants kind of follow up again, more from the social perspective, but the incidence of relationship breakdown, formations of second households, blended families, that imposes a cost that, what our traditional conception of a nuclear family in the 1970s, 1980s had a certain cost profile. But when you map that kind of relationship breakdown, or whatever way you want to phrase it, into the current labour market and cost environment, that imposes a set of necessity characteristics for somebody needs to work a second job. So there are interesting angles there. We don't claim in the paper, in the long version paper, to cover all of these, but we're trying to surface issues and pose those questions, be answered either by ourselves or someone else who wants to take a look at that later.
So Harry, are you happy, or did you want to add to any?
No, I think Dermot covered everything there probably. Just thank everyone for their suggestions. In terms of the interaction terms, and that's definitely something we can look at in research.
Yeah, so thanks all the authors. It's an excellent paper actually, and the data work was excellent. It's lovely having a time series, and it will be more work to come from it. So and thanks to the excellent discussions and the questions. I think it adds. So as usual in SSISI, what you can actually find is that the paper incorporates all these great issues. So then you read the paper and then you read the discussions and you go, but they did that. And then sometimes when the journal, under my regime, sometimes the journal can come out kind of late and people update their paper, so they're writing, they can actually have a vision of the future. You can actually, even though they gave it today, they can incorporate future visions, but with Kira, that's not going to happen. It comes out on time, so that's the way it's going to be. So John, do you have any remarks?
The next meeting?
Yeah.
The next meeting will be on March 27th. It's our Barrington lecture this time. So the winner this year was Dr. Greta Moen from the ESRI. And interesting that you're saying a lot of analysis on well-being and the economic impacts of those considerations. Greta's paper is going to be an analysis of loneliness and links to mental health.
So thanks to CSO and Cork for hosting us, and we'll see you next time. And so again, thanks for everyone joining us online. And thanks to everyone here.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you.